Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here, as always, is to take some really big, complex source material and boil it down to the essentials. The stuff you actually need to know to feel truly informed.
Yeah, get right to the core of it.
Exactly. And today we're diving into something pretty heavy, honestly. We're wrestling with why these huge, incredibly expensive wars, the ones designed to rebuild whole nations, seem to consistently, almost predictably fail.
It's a pattern, isn't it? A grim one.
It really is. Our main source today is Adam Munish's analysis of what he calls armed state-building operations. And of course, it really centers on the longest, most recent example of collapse, the U.S. effort in Afghanistan.
Right.
We're trying to look beyond just, bad strategies or specific policy mistakes. We want to get at the deeper structural constraints that maybe make success almost impossible from the start.
And that failure in Afghanistan, it just demands that kind of deeper look, doesn't it? We were trying to pull out the core mechanics of why failure seems almost guaranteed in these situations. We're not really talking about blaming one general or, one bad decision. We're looking at these massive kind of uncontrollable forces, things like geography, time pressure, organizational issues, forces so big they basically decide the outcome before the first boots are even on the ground.
And Afghanistan feels like the ultimate, just tragic proof of this. 20 years.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the scale. This was the biggest, most expensive armed state-building effort ever. 20 years, trillions of dollars, so many lives lost.
Yeah.
And the whole thing, the government, the U.S. backed, it just evaporated. In 9 days, August 2021, the speed was just stunning.
9 days for a state that took 2 decades to build, supposedly. There's that anecdote in the source material about President Ghani leaving. It says a lot about how hollow it all was.
Oh, completely. It speaks volumes. The panic was absolute. Ghani had promised weeks before, we'll fight to the last man, that kind of thing. And then, boom, he reportedly fled so fast he didn't even grab his passport or his sandals.
Wow.
That sudden final implosion just tells you everything about the lack of real roots, the lack of legitimacy, the lack of structural depth in the state we spent 2 decades trying to build.
Well, brings us right to the core idea for this deep dive. Armed state building is, and this is the phrase used, overdetermined for failure. It sounds, fatalistic.
It does, but it's actually a concept from social science. Overdetermined means you have so many powerful factors, so many causes, all pushing relentlessly towards one specific outcome.
Okay.
That basically no single policy choice, no matter how smart, can really change the final result. It's like the deck is stacked so heavily against you.
So in this context, the constraints, geography, time, the way the military is set up, they're just too powerful.
Exactly. They essentially cancel out any positive effect your strategy might have. It's like Munish uses this analogy, like trying to swim against a powerful riptide at night, aiming for some island you can barely see. The environment itself just overwhelms your effort. Strategy becomes almost irrelevant.
That's a really important distinction. It shifts the focus from what tactical mistakes did we make to what was structurally impossible from the get-go.
Precisely.
And the sources break down these massive constraints into 4 main buckets, which we'll unpack. First, the pre-existing conditions and the facts on the ground you just can't change.
Right, the starting point.
Second, ticking clocks, the pressures of time that force bad choices. Third, dilemmas, these sort of internal conflicts within the intervening military itself.
The organizational friction.
And finally, paradoxes, where the actions you take, like giving aid or security, actually backfire and make things worse.
Yeah, the unintended consequences that undermine the whole project.
Okay, let's dive into that first force, pre-existing conditions. These are the things that are already there, the fixed landscape, that riptide you mentioned, that make it such an uphill battle right from day one.
Exactly. These are the conditions that almost universally in these target states make internal conflict more likely, make governance assistance less effective, and just generally fuel local resistance against the intervener.
So what are the big ones?
We can basically group them into 2 main areas: the physical landscape, inaccessible geography, and then the socio-political landscape, fragmentation and resentment.
Geography seems like the obvious one, especially with Afghanistan. The whole graveyard of empires idea.
And it's not just a catchy phrase, right? That reputation comes directly from how the physical terrain hinders the basic functions of a state. Afghanistan's incredibly rugged terrain, especially the Hindu Kush Mountains slicing through it. Well, it fundamentally jacks up the cost of everything a state needs to do.
Like what specifically?
Well, think about building a legitimate state. You need to collect taxes, right?
Yeah.
You need to enforce laws, gather basic intelligence about what's happening in your own territory.
Okay.
But if large parts of your country are incredibly hard to reach mountains, remote valleys, deserts, doing any of that becomes exponentially harder and more expensive. Imagine trying to build roads, set up secure police stations, or even just count the population in some valley that takes 3 days to reach by donkey.
Right. The state just can't project power easily.
Exactly. And the flip side is true for insurgents.
Ah, so it lowers their costs.
Precisely. Insurgents thrive where the government can't easily reach. If the state isn't there providing services, collecting taxes, enforcing justice, then who steps in? The opposition, the Taliban, local warlords, whoever. They offer their own version of governance, justice, maybe protection. They fill the vacuum.
And tied right into that is the problem of borders, right? Porous borders giving insurgents safe havens.
Oh, absolutely crucial. The sources make it really clear. Intervention failure often goes hand in hand with having neighbors who aren't cooperative or are actively hostile to your goals.
And in Afghanistan, that neighbor was Pakistan.
Without a doubt. By late 2002, early 2003, really early on, the Taliban were already setting up shop across the border, moving weapons, training fighters, basing their leadership in Pakistan's tribal areas.
So they could just launch attacks and run back.
It's exactly. Launch attacks in Afghanistan, then melt back across the border where the U.S. and Afghan forces couldn't easily follow. It meant the U.S. was fighting an enemy that could essentially disappear whenever things got intense, a constant sanctuary.
But the U.S. couldn't just, ignore the border or force Pakistan to completely shut it down. Why was Pakistan so uncooperative? What was their strategic thinking?
Well, it boils down to geopolitics, specifically Pakistan's relationship with India. Pakistan sees India as this huge conventional military threat on its eastern border.
Okay.
So Pakistan has this deep, overriding fear of being squeezed between India and a strong, unified, potentially pro-India Afghanistan on its western border. They call it needing strategic depth.
Meaning they want Afghanistan to be weak or at least friendly to them.
Or at least not hostile, and certainly not closely allied with India. So to prevent that scenario, Pakistan has historically been incentivized to tolerate and sometimes even actively support groups like the Taliban, who oppose a strong central Afghan government aligned with the West or India.
So the U.S. goal of building a strong, stable, pro-Western Afghan state was directly against Pakistan's core security interests.
Fundamentally, it put the U.S. in this unwinnable position. You're trying to build up a state, but its most important neighbor, a nuclear-armed power, has deep strategic reasons to undermine your entire project. You can't really build a stable house if your next-door neighbor is constantly trying to knock down the walls.
That really highlights the structural impossibility. So does the source argue the U.S. shouldn't have intervened at all, or just that the strategy regarding Pakistan was doomed?
It leans heavily towards the idea that the objective itself, building that strong, centralized pro-Western state, was flawed from the start precisely because it clashed so directly with the unchangeable interests of a key regional player. The goal itself might have been unrealistic given the geopolitical realities.
Okay, moving beyond the physical terrain, what about the socio-political conditions?
Wow.
Ethnic fragmentation and resentment.
Yeah, this is huge in many of these conflict zones. When you have a country with multiple ethnic groups, think Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks in Afghanistan, or Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds in Iraq, who often have histories of rivalry. Well, that fragmentation dramatically increases the chances of conflict starting and makes it last longer.
Why is that? What's the dynamic?
It's often not about ideology. Fundamentally, it's about survival and power, especially when everyone knows the foreign intervener will eventually leave. Each group starts thinking, what happens when the Americans go home? If Group X controls the government, will they persecute us? Will they hoard all the resources? So they compete, often violently, to grab control of the state machinery, the ministries, the security forces, to protect their own group's interests.
Yeah.
It becomes a zero-sum game for future security.
And that competition was happening right inside the government the U.S. was supporting.
Constantly. Jockeying for positions, for resources, for influence, it makes unified governance incredibly difficult.
And then there's the resentment towards the interveners themselves. The source says this isn't just a temporary reaction to a bad policy, it's sort of baked in.
It really is. I mean, think about it. Armed state building, by its very nature, means foreign soldiers are coming into your country, often using force, trying to impose a different system of rules and governance. Even if the stated goals are noble democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, the very act violates local norms, local laws, local consent. It's inherently an imposition.
So resistance is almost guaranteed.
Some level of resistance, yes. And the sources point to this recurring problem of Western projection.
What exactly is meant by that? Western projection.
It's this often unconscious bias where Western policymakers or military leaders assume that people everywhere basically want the same things they do in the same way and see the world through the same liberal democratic lens.
They project their own values and assumptions onto a completely different context.
Exactly. Yeah. There's this anecdote in the source material about a U.S. Army colonel in Iraq. Apparently, he carried a pocket-sized copy of the U.S. Constitution with him everywhere.
Okay.
And he genuinely believed that the main thing stopping Iraq from becoming a stable democracy was just that the Iraqis hadn't, read the U.S. Constitution. That if they just had this document, everything would click into place.
Wow. That's quite a disconnect.
It perfectly illustrates the problem. It completely ignores Iraq's own complex history, its tribal structures, the deep sectarian divides, the legacy of authoritarian rule, the natural resistance to foreign occupation. He thought the solution was just exporting this one Western text. It shows a profound failure to understand the local reality.
Okay, so if these pre-existing conditions, the geography, the fragmentation, the inevitable resentment, the Western projection, are so powerful and make success so unlikely, why do we keep trying? Why does the military, why do policymakers seem to hold on to this belief that comprehensive state building can work? Where does that hope, or maybe that misperception, come from?
That's a crucial question. And the answer, according to the sources, largely comes from misreading history. Specifically, it comes from including a couple major historical anomalies in the data set. Post-World War II Germany and Japan.
The classic examples always brought up.
Exactly. People often point to them as proof that state building under occupation can succeed. And if you include them, the success rate for U.S. interventions looks somewhat better. Paul Miller's research is cited here. He shows the U.S. success rate might look like, say, 39% if you include Germany and Japan. But if you take them out, because the conditions were so unique and unrepeatable, that success rate plummets dramatically, down to near zero for comprehensive state building in unfavorable conditions, including Germany and Japan, basically skews the data and gives a totally false sense of possibility.
So what made Germany and Japan so unique? What were those unrepeatable conditions back in 1945 that just weren't there in Afghanistan or Iraq?
The sources highlight three really big ones. First, Germany and Japan already had strong pre-existing state foundations before the war, meaning they had high literacy rates, established universities, a skilled workforce, a significant industrial base, strong bureaucratic traditions. They had deep wells of human capital. The U.S. wasn't building a state from scratch. It was helping rebuild and redirect existing structures. That's fundamentally different from places like Afghanistan or Somalia.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second condition?
Second was the sheer scale of destruction before the occupation began. Germany, in particular, was devastated. The Allies dropped something like 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany. Cities were rubble. The population was exhausted, defeated.
So people recognized the need for help.
Yes. That total military defeat and physical destruction created a widespread local understanding that they needed external help just to survive and rebuild. There wasn't the same dynamic of ongoing resistance you see when an intervention happens in a less comprehensively defeated state.
And the third unique condition?
This one might be the most important.
Yeah.
The immediate emergence of a massive, terrifying external threat, the Soviet Union.
Right, the Cold War starting immediately.
Yeah. Exactly. Suddenly, for people in West Germany and Japan, the American occupiers weren't just occupiers. They were also protectors against what was seen as a much worse alternative, Soviet domination. This external threat powerfully aligned local interests with the American presence. People were willing to cooperate with the U.S. because the alternative seemed infinitely worse.
And none of those three conditions, strong pre-existing state, total prior destruction creating acceptance, and a unifying external enemy existed in Afghanistan in 2001 or Iraq in 2003.
Not even close. Afghanistan was already devastated by decades of war, yes, but lacked those strong state foundations. Iraq had some foundations, but wasn't totally destroyed prior to invasion, and resentment was immediate. And crucially, in both cases, there wasn't a universally perceived external enemy that made the U.S. presence preferable. In fact, the U.S. became the primary enemy for significant parts of the population.
Let's make this concrete with that purge example. The difference between denazification in Germany and de-Baathification in Iraq is just stark.
It's a devastating comparison, and it really highlights that human capital point. Denazification in Germany, while complicated, basically worked because Germany had that deep pool of skilled people.
So when former Nazi Party members were removed from government jobs,
They had other options. They could use their skills to become engineers, mechanics, teachers, business owners, whatever. Society had alternative pathways for them. They weren't automatically driven to desperation or insurgency because they had other ways to make a living and maintain some status.
But in Iraq, after Saddam fell, the U.S. policy of de-Baathification had the completely opposite effect.
It was catastrophic.
Yeah.
Iraq, unlike post-war Germany, had suffered from decades of underdevelopment, sanctions, and war. The Ba'athist state, however brutal, was the primary employer for educated and skilled people. It was the main source of income, stability, social status for hundreds of thousands of engineers, doctors, military officers, administrators, intelligence agents.
And the U.S. purged them all.
Effectively, yes. CPA Order Number 1 barred senior Ba'ath Party members from public employment, and Order Number 2 dissolved the entire Iraqi military. We're talking about potentially 400,000 people, many highly skilled and experienced, suddenly thrown out of work, stripped of their pensions, their status, their future, in a country with massive unemployment and few private sector opportunities.
So what happened to them?
They were left with nothing. Humiliated, angry, unemployed, often armed, and crucially, they knew each other. They had organizational skills. What did the U.S. expect them to do? They became the backbone of the insurgency.
The very people who knew how the system worked, how to organize, how to fight.
Precisely. Many of the key leaders and skilled operatives who later formed groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq and eventually the Islamic State came directly from this pool of purged Ba'athist military and intelligence officers. The U.S. intervention, through this one policy designed to cleanse the old regime, effectively manufactured its own most capable and motivated enemy. It turned potential partners, or at least neutral parties, into die-hard opponents by destroying their livelihoods.
Wow, so the pre-existing conditions alone make it seem almost impossible. Let's pivot now to the second major force multiplying these difficulties. The ticking clocks. These aren't fixed conditions, but dynamic pressures related to time that seem to actively push everyone towards bad, short-sighted decisions, self-sabotage, essentially.
Yeah, time is a killer in these operations. And the problem is you have multiple clocks ticking at different rates, often creating what economists call perverse incentives, situations where rational actors are pushed to do things that undermine the overall goal.
Okay, so what are the main clocks? There's the political clock back home for the interveners, right?
Absolutely. For the intervening power, like the U.S., the clock is relentless. You've got election cycles. Public support inevitably degrades over time as costs mount and progress seems slow. Politicians feel constant pressure to show results quickly and find an exit strategy.
Like wanting to be out before the next election.
Exactly. The source material mentions how early on in the Obama administration's Afghanistan surge, around 2010, Vice President Biden was already telling advisors he needed a short-term exit strategy. Not because the mission was accomplished, but because the domestic political clock was ticking. That pressure for speed filters down and affects everything.
Okay, so that's the interveners clock. What about the clock for the local leaders, the Afghan government we were supposedly helping? Does it tick differently?
Completely differently. And this creates a huge misalignment of interests. For local elites, like the Ghani government in Afghanistan, the incentive is often the opposite. They want to slow things down.
Why would they want to delay?
Think about it. As long as the U.S. perceives the Afghan state as weak and needing help, the money keeps flowing. Billions in aid, security guarantees, military support. That external funding is the basis of their power and wealth.
So if they actually succeed in building a self-sufficient state?
The justification for the massive U.S. presence and funding disappears. So there's a perverse incentive to avoid making the really hard reforms tackling corruption, building a real tax base, creating genuine legitimacy, because achieving those things would signal self-sufficiency and hasten the departure of the foreign patrons.
So they drag their feet on reforms to keep the money flowing.
Essentially, yes. Delaying genuine progress becomes a rational strategy for survival for the local elite, even though it guarantees the state remains fragile and dependent. The U.S. wants quick success and exit. The local partner often benefits from slow progress and continued dependency. The clocks are working against each other.
And then there's a third clock, right? Inside the U.S. military itself, the career clock for officers.
Yes, and this one is powerful. Military careers are built on relatively short cycles. Deployments for conventional units are often just 12, maybe 15 months. That's nothing in the context of a 20-year nation-building project.
So officers rotate in and out quickly.
Very quickly. And the promotion system, historically, heavily rewards experience in conventional combat operations, decisive battles, kinetic action. That's what gets you noticed, gets you promoted.
Not the slow, messy work of state building.
Not typically, no. building relationships with village elders, training local police, overseeing infrastructure projects that's slow, complex, often doesn't produce easily measurable results within a single tour, and it's generally seen as less prestigious than leading troops in combat. So commanders on the ground, even with the best intentions, are often incentivized by their own career clock to prioritize short-term, visible, often kinetic actions over the long-term, patient work that state building actually requires.
So all these ticking clocks, political pressure for quick results, local incentives to delay, military career incentives for combat, they combine to create this pressure cooker environment.
Exactly. And this pressure leads directly to one of the most damaging behaviors, the manipulation of metrics.
Cooking the books to show progress that isn't really there.
Well, it's often more subtle than outright lying, though that happened too. It's about choosing to measure the wrong things, or spinning the data to fit the desired narrative of success, because the clocks demand that narrative.
The classic example always cited is Vietnam, right? The body count.
The body count is the perfect tragic example. Was counting enemy dead a meaningful measure of progress towards building a stable, legitimate South Vietnamese state? Of course not. It was analytically useless for that goal.
But it was quantifiable.
Exactly. It was a number you could track, put on a chart, and show going up or down. So it became the primary metric of success, simply because it was measurable and seemed to indicate action. And that metric then drove tactics commanders were pushed to conduct operations that generated higher body counts, like massive artillery bombardments or search and destroy missions, even if those tactics alienated the population and undermined the larger political goal. The metric distorted the strategy.
How did the same dynamic play out in Afghanistan? Were we just counting Taliban casualties?
There was some of that, but the manipulation was often more sophisticated, according to the sources. It was about constantly reframing the data to fit the progress narrative demanded by Washington.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The source material quotes officials describing how bad news was spun. For instance, if the number of Taliban attacks went up, the official line wouldn't be, "the Taliban are getting stronger." No, it would be spun as, "well, that's because the Afghan security forces are controlling more territory, so there are more targets for the Taliban to hit." Or, alternatively, the Taliban are getting desperate because we're winning, so they're lashing out with more attacks.
So either way, we're winning.
Exactly. Heads we win, tails you lose. The narrative of progress had to be maintained for the political clock back home, regardless of what the data actually suggested about the situation on the ground. They weren't necessarily lying about the numbers themselves, but they were constantly changing the interpretation of the numbers to mean success.
But you mentioned earlier a really critical flaw in the metrics measuring performance instead of effectiveness. Can you unpack that a bit more? That seems key.
It's absolutely crucial. Performance is about inputs and outputs, things that are easy to count. Effectiveness is about outcomes and impact, much harder to measure, especially quickly.
So give me an example.
Okay, take the Commander's Emergency Response Program, CRP funds. This was money commanders could spend quickly on local projects. Performance metrics were things like, how many schools did we build? How many wells did we dig? How many kilometers of road did we pave this month?
Numbers that look good on a PowerPoint slide back at headquarters.
Precisely. Quick, tangible results. That's measuring performance. But effectiveness would ask, okay, we built a school, but were qualified teachers ever hired? Did students actually attend? Is the school still functioning 6 months after the U.S. unit left? We paved a road, but is it actually maintained? Is it helping local commerce or just making it easier for insurgents to move?
And we weren't measuring that effectiveness.
Overwhelmingly, no. Because measuring effectiveness is slow, it's complicated, it requires long-term monitoring. The ticking clocks demanded quick, easy performance metrics. So the focus was entirely on the inputs, spending the money, building the things, without rigorously checking if those things actually led to sustainable improvements or positive outcomes. It created this illusion of progress, this massive, expensive Potemkin village that was bound to collapse once the external inputs stopped.
And this pressure for speed, for quantity over quality, also directly impacted how the Afghan security forces themselves were built.
Absolutely. The political clock demanded that the U.S. show it was building a capable Afghan National Security Force, ANSF, that could take over, allowing the U.S. to leave. The easiest way to show progress was just getting troop numbers up quickly.
So quantity over quality.
Exactly. To meet arbitrary target numbers for the size of the Afghan National Army, ANA, and police, training times were often drastically cut. Vetting standards were lowered. Literacy requirements were minimal.
Which leads to
which leads to poorly trained, poorly led forces with low morale, high desertion rates, and significant infiltration by the Taliban.
Yeah.
You get a force that looks big on paper, but is hollow inside. Again, prioritizing the easily measured metric, number of troops trained, over the hard-to-measure but crucial outcome, actual combat effectiveness and loyalty.
And the model itself, the kind of military we tried to build for them, was also a problem.
A huge problem. The U.S. essentially tried to create a miniature version of a Western conventional military in Afghanistan. Heavy equipment, complex logistics, reliant on air power, sophisticated command and control.
Things Afghanistan couldn't afford or sustain on its own?
Never. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. It had no realistic prospect of ever generating the domestic revenue needed to maintain such an expensive high-tech force. This model guaranteed perpetual dependency on foreign funding, foreign contractors, foreign advisors.
So we built them a military they couldn't possibly keep running once we left.
That's exactly what happened. Instead of building a force that was perhaps lighter, more suited to counterinsurgency in their terrain, and sustainable within their means, we imposed our own expensive model. This guaranteed it would collapse when the external support inevitably dried up, which the ticking political clock eventually demanded.
It's striking that the elite Afghan commandos, the ones who actually did most of the effective fighting,
Yeah, estimates are they did maybe 70–80% of the offensive operations.
they only started serious training relatively late, right? Like 2007?
That's right, about 6 years into the war. For the first half of the conflict, the focus was overwhelmingly on building those large, conventional, ultimately ineffective A&A units because that fit the quantity metric and the conventional mindset. It took years to recognize the need for and invest seriously in the specialized counterinsurgency forces that were actually making a difference. Another example of how the pressure for quick, visible, conventional-style progress undermined the development of genuinely effective, albeit smaller-scale, capabilities.
Okay, so we've got the unchangeable pre-existing conditions and the distorting pressure of ticking clocks. Now let's turn the focus inward to the intervening power itself, the U.S. military and government. The third and fourth constraints you mentioned are dilemmas and paradoxes, which show how the system can sort of defeat itself. Let's start with the dilemma.
The core dilemma, as the sources frame it, stems from the U.S. military being asked to do two fundamentally different, almost contradictory things at the same time.
Which are?
On the one hand, it's expected to conduct these incredibly complex, slow, nuanced state-building and counterinsurgency campaigns. But on the other hand, its primary institutional focus, its budget, its culture, its entire structure is geared towards preparing for and fighting conventional, high-intensity wars against peer competitors, think Russia or China.
So state building versus big power war. And the military is really built for the second one.
Overwhelmingly. That's where the big money is, the advanced fighter jets, the aircraft carriers, the tanks. That's where the institutional prestige lies. That's what the organizational culture values most highly. State building, counterinsurgency. These are often viewed within the institution as, frankly, a distraction, a lesser included mission, or something that gets in the way of being ready for the real war.
How does that bias actually play out on the ground during an intervention like Afghanistan or Iraq?
It means that when push comes to shove, the conventional combat priorities almost always win out over the state-building needs. The source material gives this stark example from Fallujah in Iraq, involving a Marine civil affairs officer.
What happened?
His unit was responsible for the governance side, working with local leaders, reconstruction, etc. But when major fighting broke out, the commanders needed more trigger pullers. So they pulled out his civil affairs teams, his interpreters, his governance experts, and the people actually doing the long-term state-building work and replaced them with standard infantry Marines.
Sacrificing the long-term goal for short-term combat power.
Exactly. The immediate need for survivability and kinetic effectiveness, which is the military's core competency and priority, trumped the mission they were supposedly there to achieve, building a stable local government. The institution defaulted to what it knows.
See this bias structurally too, right? In terms of which organizations stick around after a war and which ones disappear.
Oh, absolutely. This is a really telling indicator. Think about organizations that support conventional warfare, like the Army Corps of Engineers, who build bridges and bases, or the Navy Seabees, who do construction. These capabilities are seen as essential for any type of large-scale military operation, so they are permanent parts of the force structure. They always survive peacetime budget cuts and demobilizations.
Okay.
But what about the organizations created specifically for governance assistance or state building? like the Provincial Reconstruction Teams, PRTs in Afghanistan, or the Accords Program, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, which was actually quite effective in Vietnam.
What happens to them?
They're created during the conflict as an ad hoc necessity, and then they're almost always dismantled immediately afterwards. Why? Because the institutional assessment is that they don't contribute directly to the military's primary mission, readiness for conventional war.
So the expertise is just lost.
Completely. The institutional memory of how to actually do state building effectively gets wiped clean after every conflict. We have to relearn the same painful lessons every single time, starting from scratch, because the capability isn't valued enough to be maintained permanently within the conventional focus structure.
This focus on military objectives even warped how aid money was used, leading to this concept of money as a weapon system.
Yes, that phrase itself tells you everything. CPOPE funds, the Commander's Emergency Response Program money, was explicitly framed not just as development aid, but as a tactical tool for commanders. The actual guidance document was titled Money as a Weapon System Afghanistan.
So it wasn't about long-term development.
Primarily, no. It was about achieving short-term military effects. Use money to quickly gain temporary goodwill in an area you just cleared. Pay locals for information. Fund a quick project to employ young men who might otherwise join the insurgency. Rebuild a bridge quickly to facilitate military movement. It was tactical spending, driven by the commander's immediate operational needs on a short deployment cycle.
Not strategic investment.
Not usually, no. And this militarization of aid had another negative effect. It blurred the lines between soldiers handing out cash for tactical reasons and legitimate, independent civilian aid workers doing long-term development. When aid becomes just another military tool, those civilian aid workers become targets. Because insurgents can't easily distinguish between them and the military mission, it actually made the environment more dangerous for NGOs.
Okay, that covers the organizational dilemmas. Now let's look at the fourth force, the paradoxes. These are situations where actions, often taken with good intentions, end up producing the opposite of the desired outcome, creating more instability. The first one is aid dependency.
Right. We touched on this with the ticking clocks. But it's a fundamental paradox. The massive sustained flood of foreign money into a country like Afghanistan, while intended to build capacity, actually created what's known as a rentier state.
What does that mean, a rentier state?
A rentier state is a government that gets most of its revenue not from taxing its own citizens or fostering productive domestic industry, but from external sources, rents. This could be oil revenue, or in Afghanistan's case, massive amounts of foreign aid. At peaks, something like 90% of the Afghan government's budget came from international donors.
So the government doesn't need its own people for revenue.
Exactly. And that breaks the fundamental link of accountability between a government and its citizens. Normally, governments need to provide services and security to convince their people to pay taxes. That creates a social contract.
But if the money comes from outside?
Then the government's primary accountability shifts. It becomes accountable not to its own population, but to the foreign donors writing the checks. Leaders spend their energy pleasing Washington, Brussels, or Kabul's donor community, managing perceptions, hitting donor-mandated metrics, rather than building genuine legitimacy or delivering services out in the provinces. They don't need the loyalty of their farmers. They need the continued flow of dollars.
And this guarantees collapse when the aid leaves.
It makes it almost inevitable, because the state hasn't built the internal foundations, a real economy, a functioning tax system, a reciprocal relationship with its people. Its structures are entirely dependent on external funds. Pull the plug on the funding, as the U.S. eventually did, and the whole edifice collapses, because it has no independent means of support and often very little popular legitimacy.
Okay, the next paradox is the security paradox. The source uses Vietnam as the prime example, showing how the U.S. presence actually weakened the South Vietnamese military, the ARVN. How did that work?
It's a really counterintuitive but crucial dynamic in alliances, especially asymmetric ones. The massive presence of the U.S. military as a security guarantor fundamentally changed the political calculations for the South Vietnamese leader, President Thieu.
How so?
With the U.S. military essentially guaranteeing South Vietnam's survival against the external threat, North Vietnam Thieu's primary security concern shifted inward. He became less worried about the communists crossing the border and more worried about his own generals launching a coup against him. Regime survival became his top priority.
So he started coup-proofing his own military.
Precisely. He deliberately designed the ARVN command structure to prevent his generals from coordinating easily or acting independently. Command was rigidly centralized. Important decisions, even tactical ones on the battlefield, often had to be cleared through Thieu's palace in Saigon. Promotions were based on loyalty to him, not competence.
Which is terrible for actually fighting a war.
Absolutely disastrous. Effective modern warfare, especially counterinsurgency, requires initiative, flexibility, rapid decision-making at lower levels, decentralized command. But Thieu's coup-proving measures enforced the exact opposite. Rigid hierarchy, slow decision-making, commanders afraid to act without explicit orders from the top.
So the structure designed to keep Thieu in power made his army ineffective.
Guaranteed its ineffectiveness. The most famous example is the disastrous Lamson 719 operation, the ARVN invasion of Laos in 1971. Units got bogged down constantly, waiting hours or days for decisions from Saigon, while North Vietnamese forces maneuvered freely and chewed them up. The U.S. presence, by reducing Thieu's fear of external defeat, allowed him to prioritize internal political control over military competence, ultimately contributing to the ARVN's inability to stand alone. A real paradox.
And the final paradox. Counterproductive counter-narcotics in Afghanistan. This sounds like a no-win situation.
It really was a classic catch-22. Everyone knew opium production fueled the Taliban insurgency through taxes and trafficking, and also fueled massive corruption within the Afghan government the U.S. was supporting. So, logically, you have to do something about the drug trade, right?
Seems necessary. Eradicate the poppy fields.
Right. But the paradox was, for huge numbers of poor, rural Afghans, especially in the South, growing poppies was their only viable livelihood. It was the only crop that provided enough income to feed their families in that harsh environment with limited infrastructure.
So when eradication programs came in,
Especially things like aerial spraying, which destroyed the crop but offered no immediate viable alternative income source. It instantly impoverished entire communities. You wiped out their main source of cash overnight.
and where do desperate, impoverished farmers turn?
Often, they turned to the only other source of income available in those areas, the Taliban. The insurgency offered salaries. So the very effort to cut off Taliban funding by eradicating poppies inadvertently became a massive recruitment tool for the Taliban. Farmers joined not out of ideology, but out of sheer economic desperation created by the counter-narcotics efforts.
So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Ignore the opium, and you fund the enemy and corruption. Eradicate it without viable alternatives, and you drive the population into the enemy's arms.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of a structural trap where any action taken seems to create perverse, counterproductive outcomes, further highlighting the inherent difficulty of the state-building enterprise in such complex environments.
Okay, so we've laid out a pretty convincing case, based on the source material, that comprehensive armed state building, especially in these unfavorable conditions, is just structurally set up for failure. The pre-existing conditions, the time pressures, the internal dilemmas, the paradoxes, they all stack up.
Yeah, the odds are overwhelmingly against success.
So the crucial question then becomes, if these big nation-building interventions are almost doomed, but sometimes intervention is necessary for, say, core national security interests, what are the alternatives? Does the source offer any models for interventions that might actually be worth fighting because they are limited and have a chance of success?
It does. The key takeaway is that success becomes possible only when you radically limit the political objective and, ideally, operate under more favorable conditions. If your goal is unlimited, total victory, complete regime change, building a Western-style democracy from the ground up, you're almost certainly going to fail because the costs and resistance will spiral out of control.
So think smaller, more focused goals.
Exactly. Low cost, limited objectives, tailored to the specific context. The sources offer a couple examples that contrast sharply with Afghanistan or Iraq.
Okay, like what? The first one mentioned is Iceland during World War II. Seems like an odd comparison.
It seems odd, but it illustrates the principle of restraint under favorable conditions. What was the U.S. objective in Iceland during WWII? It wasn't to remake Icelandic society. It was purely strategic and very limited.
Yeah.
Control the sea lanes in the North Atlantic, the GIUK gap, to protect shipping from German U-boats.
A vital military objective.
Absolutely. And how did the U.S. achieve it? By occupying the island, yes, but under very favorable conditions. There was no fighting. The local Icelandic population was generally cooperative, see the U.S. presence as protection against potential Nazi aggression.
And the U.S. actions benefited Iceland too.
Yes, significantly. The U.S. focused on building the infrastructure needed for its strategic goal ports, airfields, roads. This directly benefited the Icelandic economy and people. So it was low cost, no combat, low risk, cooperative population, achieved a specific, limited strategic objective, provided mutual benefits, and then the U.S. left when the strategic need ended. No attempt at political engineering.
Simplicity and alignment of interests. Okay, what's the second model? Security Force Assistance, SFA, in Colombia. That sounds more relevant to modern conflicts.
Colombia is presented as a potential high-reward case. Again, achieved through significant restraint. The U.S. provided assistance to the Colombian government in its long fight against the FARC insurgency. But crucially, U.S. involvement was strictly limited. There was a hard cap, mandated by Congress, on the number of U.S. military personnel and contractors allowed in the country, initially 800 personnel and 600 contractors, later reduced.
A cap. So that forced the U.S. to be selective.
Precisely. That structural limit prevented the mission creep we saw in Afghanistan. The U.S. couldn't just flood the zone with troops or try to take over the fight. It had to focus on a supporting role, on targeted assistance.
And what kind of assistance was effective?
The key was interest alignment. The U.S. and the Colombian government both wanted to defeat FARC and providing the right kind of training. Instead of trying to build a massive conventional army like in Afghanistan, the U.S. focused on helping Colombia develop highly specialized, elite counterinsurgency forces, like the famous Jungle Commandos.
Trained specifically for Colombia's environment and threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not trained to fight a conventional war they'd never face, but trained to operate effectively in the jungles against the FARC. This targeted SFA significantly increased the capabilities of the Colombian forces, put immense pressure on FARC, degraded their leadership, and is widely credited with helping push FARC towards the negotiating table and the eventual peace deal.
So limited U.S. footprint, aligned interests, and appropriate specialized training for the partner force without trying to remake the whole country.
That's the model.
Yeah.
Help the existing legitimate state improve its own capacity to handle its specific internal security threat, rather than trying to impose an external model or change the political system.
The source material uses a framework, a kind of 2x2 matrix, to help think about these decisions, right? Comparing the type of intervention, restrained versus comprehensive, with the conditions, favorable versus unfavorable.
Yeah, it's a useful analytical tool. The top right box, comprehensive intervention in unfavorable conditions. Think Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003. That's the quadrant labeled overdetermined for failure. The structural constraints are just too high.
Okay.
Then you might have restrained intervention in unfavorable conditions, maybe like the limited support to various Syrian rebel groups. The sources might categorize this as leading to performative failure. You're doing something, showing effort, but the conditions are so bad, the partner is so fragmented, that you achieve very little strategic benefit, often at considerable risk and cost, maybe even empowering future enemies.
And the successful examples, Iceland and Colombia, would fall into restrained intervention under favorable or moderately favorable conditions.
Exactly, where the goals are limited, interests align, and the context allows for success without massive transformative effort.
How does this framework help analyze choices today, like comparing support for Ukraine versus past involvement in Syria?
It highlights how critical the political objective is. Supporting Ukraine, according to this framework, looks like a potentially favorable, cost-effective case for restrained intervention. Why?
Because the goal is limited.
Yes, the core goal is relatively limited and status quo-oriented. Helping Ukraine maintain its existence as a sovereign state against an external aggressor. It's not about overthrowing a regime or building a new state from scratch.
And the partner is unified.
And your partner, the Ukrainian government and people, are unified, highly motivated by an existential threat, and largely share democratic values. This maximizes the chances that your assistance, weapons, intelligence, training will be used effectively towards a shared goal. Maintaining an existing order is fundamentally easier and less costly than trying to create a new one.
Whereas Syria was the opposite.
Syria was inherently unfavorable for the kind of intervention that was attempted. The objective there wasn't just to degrade ISIS, but also involved calls for overthrowing the Assad regime and somehow remaking the Syrian state.
Which required partnering with rebels.
Yes, partnering with a very fragmented, disorganized coalition of rebel groups, many with competing agendas, some with extremist ideologies. Trying to overthrow a regime and build a new political order through such unreliable proxies in such a complex, multi-sided conflict is exponentially harder, costlier, and more prone to blowback than helping an existing legitimate state defend itself.
So the takeaway is, the scope of the political objective is everything. If you aim for total transformation, especially in tough conditions, you're likely doomed. Limit the goal, align interests, and maybe you have a chance.
That's what the analysis strongly suggests. The political objective dictates the scale of effort required. Unlimited objectives invite unlimited resistance and exponentially increasing costs, usually overwhelming whatever resources and strategy you bring to bear.
This has been incredibly illuminating, if also deeply sobering. We've walked through how the failure of these massive armed state-building projects isn't just bad luck or bad strategy, it's structural. It's rooted in the unchangeable geography in politics, the relentless pressure of time, the internal biases of the organizations we use, and the unavoidable paradoxes of intervention itself. It seems, based on this analysis, the outcome in places like Afghanistan was almost foreordained.
That's the tough, evidence-based conclusion for the source material, yes. The constraints are just immense, often insurmountable when the goal is comprehensive transformation. But there's one final constraint we need to touch on, perhaps the hardest one to overcome because it's psychological and political.
What's that?
The source calls it the cult of action.
The cult of action, meaning
Yeah,
the compulsion to do something.
exactly. It's the powerful bias, especially among policymakers in crises, to default to taking decisive action, often military action, even when careful analysis suggests it might be counterproductive or futile.
Why? Why do that if the evidence points the other way?
Because doing something often feels politically safer than being perceived as passive or hesitant. There's immense pressure to act, to respond forcefully. Leaders often catastrophically exaggerate the immediate, visible political risks of not acting, the risk of looking weak or indecisive.
While underestimating the costs of acting unwisely.
Precisely. They underestimate the enormous, often hidden long-term costs and unintended consequences of jumping into a complex intervention that, as we've discussed, might be structurally doomed from the start. The immediate political imperative to be seen doing something overrides cool-headed strategic calculation about whether that something will actually make things better or worse in the long run.
There's that anecdote mentioned in the sources involving Dick Cheney and Colin Powell during the lead-up to the first Gulf War that seems to capture this mindset perfectly.
It really does. Powell, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was focused on strategy. He kept asking the political leadership, including then Secretary of Defense Cheney, what did the political objective, what outcome do we want? Trying to ensure the military plan served a clear political goal.
And Cheney's response.
Cheney apparently grew impatient with the strategic questions and just demanded, I want options, General. Options for military action. The demand was for action plans, almost divorced from a clearly defined political endpoint. It exemplifies that bias. The imperative is to generate options for doing something, sometimes before the why and to what end are fully resolved. The action itself becomes the focus.
And that bias, that preference for immediate action over perhaps difficult strategic patience, it guarantees we'll keep making these mistakes, keep getting drawn into unwinnable wars because it short-circuits the kind of analysis we've been discussing today.
It's a huge obstacle to learning from past failures. If there's one final thought for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive, it's perhaps this. We have to become intensely skeptical of that cult of action. By consciously questioning that psychological and political bias within ourselves and our leaders, we need to resist the powerful temptation to equate action with effectiveness or inaction with weakness. We need to cultivate the discipline of strategic patience, even when it feels uncomfortable or looks politically risky. Sometimes, recognizing that the conditions are overwhelmingly unfavorable or that the objectives are unrealistic, the truly courageous, the truly strategic choice is to not intervene militarily at all. To accept that some problems, however tragic, are not fixable by external force, especially when that force is applied against such deeply rooted structural constraints. When is doing nothing or doing something much less ambitious the genuinely smarter path?
A profoundly challenging question, but one that seems absolutely essential after reviewing the hard lessons of the last few decades. Thank you so much for guiding us through this complex and vital material today. It really helps clarify the structural nature of these failures.
It was my pleasure. It's difficult material, but important to grapple with.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this conversation gives you a clearer lens through which to view these incredibly difficult challenges in our world.